Yeah, I got the email from
Okay.
Nicola. Yeah, sad. Yeah.
I'm going to experiment with a different way of recording today because up to this point I've been recording directly onto my machine, and yesterday unfortunately my internet really let me down, as you probably noticed from the recording of John's presentation. So I'm going to record into the Zoom cloud today, and hopefully that might be better quality. We'll see. It's always the risk with technology that it doesn't work.
When you rely on it, yeah.
John Williamson, we were meant to catch up over the weekend, weren't we? We didn't manage
Lead.
it.
The last time I presented in 2002, I think, I also gave like 2 talks. So those talks are out there on quantumdog.com, so you can see those as well if you need to.
Okay.
Some of it is a repeat of what I did last time, but some of it's related to this talk as well. So
I'm wondering, because I'm looking at downloading the talks that we got from videos that we got from last year and getting them onto that same YouTube site that this stuff is going on. But if anybody knows of other videos that are knocking around the internet that perhaps we should also collate, then we should probably be doing this.
mm-hmm.
There are videos of earlier Anpa stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know what.
I mean, clearly, I mean,
Mike Wright.
Mike Wright.
Yes, absolutely.
To ask. Mike Wright is just, has recorded, anything that he's been at, and has also tried to get other people to record if he hasn't been able to be present. So he's the man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This stuff hits you, and you realize how important it is when people die.
Yeah.
And you realize actually the voices from the past are incredibly important it's so important to preserve that.
Yeah. Yeah. I couldn't, what's the name of his wife, Peter? Do you remember?
Who? Tony?
Tony's.
Oh, I can't remember. Maybe Keith does, I don't know.
Anyone out there remember Tony's wife's name? No.
I remember her coming because she got, bad Alzheimer's, didn't she?
She did.
Remember her there at Roland's Castle.
It was hilarious. It was great.
It was bizarre.
She lightened things up, definitely. No. So I'd like to remember. I'll ask the daughters. Yeah. Hi, Vanessa. Who else is here? Let me go, because I'm late.
Keith has sent a message on chat. Bob Campbell, who also contributed to the proceedings, died recently.
Oh, really? Wow, yeah.
Is Keith's audio not working? I haven't heard any.
No, he's not got a microphone or he can hear, but he can't speak into a microphone, and he hasn't got a visual either. But it's a PC, he said.
So he can do better than Tommy then?
Well, I've got a PC and I can do it, but...
Reference win.
Tommy.
Yeah, the Who. Tommy, can you hear me?
Oh, right, that Tommy.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh boy.
I had a meeting today with the hierarchy of my university, and they were talking about what's happening in the future, and I was just saying, well, one of the most interesting things that's happened since the pandemic and the lockdown is that people are using Zoom. Everybody is using Zoom as a matter of course in a way that they weren't doing before. So, you know, there are eminent professors all over the world who are communicating and reorganizing themselves with this technology. And that's a remarkable change, I think.
It is total surveillance, isn't it wonderful?
Well, who's watching?
No.
You feel watched?
I think we don't have to be watched. It all just gets fed into these, you know, zeros and ones in a big machine. But also the whole thing, the push towards the cashless society, you know, the whole, you know, it's
Well, that is a bit disturbing. That's the Chinese thing, really, which, yeah, you can't do anything in China without your phone now.
That's right. And also, yeah. I mean, we are the most, even now, the most CCTV'd country in the world. And when someone like my son with Down syndrome gets mugged in London, it doesn't help him at all. So, but
Did
anyway,
he get mugged?
it wasn't too bad.
He got mugged.
This isn't recent. This was some years ago, and the police were great actually. But yeah, so it was down in a tube station, and he had, you know, he obviously had a support worker with him, and in fact he was with two other, you know, with a couple that he started chatting to on the train, because that's the sort of guy he is. And this guy just ran up and like bashed him and tried to take his bag, etc. And but it was anyway, yeah. So there was CCTV everywhere, but they didn't find whoever it was. But as I said, the police were really, you know, someone came and talked with him. There was a lot of help in terms of helping him to get over the trauma of it. So that was good. But anyway, yeah. But yes. So I think that it's extremist, as I was saying with this astrology. You see, I mean, this year is a very, you know, there's a polarizing, and it's a question of, you know, I don't know whether I sent that to Anpa, the whole thing. There's no new normal. There's only now strange, future stranger, and the Irish saying, a stranger is a friend that we haven't yet met. Can we co-create this? That's the question.
Lovely, thank you.
Anyway. So.
Okay, I think we're all here. I mean, well, virtually. We're all virtually here.
I like that. Yes, we're here.
I'm not sure I'm all here, I have to say, but I'm beginning to show signs of strain. But
Joseph, why are you pink?
I don't know.
No, can't hear me.
Who's pink?
Joseph. Oh, the pictures come up pink. Maybe it's something.
it is a bit, yes.
He's a symphony in pink.
Yes.
Your curtains, Joseph, are like the beginning of your show, Mark, aren't they?
Oh, okay.
Maybe he's got the light on the curtains.
Yeah.
Maybe he's got the light on the pink curtain.
So someone should do a study of the physics of symbolism. I think there's a lot of symmetry between the French and Russian symbolists and quantum mechanics. I think they'd like the pinkness of the curtains and the pinkness of my show and the pinkness of Joseph's shirt and the pinkness of Andrew's shirt, actually, which in my screen is exactly above it.
Yes, but he isn't all pink.
So there we go.
Joseph, yes. He's above it in my screen too.
Joseph is living in Andrew's stomach.
Yes. Very good. Yeah. Okay, I think we should start before we go completely crazy. Doug, do you want to share your screen?
Sure.
Yes.
As I say, I hope my recording experiment works today, and I apologize for the problems yesterday, but let's see how it goes.
Hopefully you can see all that.
Okay. Right, so I'm going to mute everybody, and wait a minute, let's do it. Right, you're all muted. And now,
I should
Doug,
be unmuted now.
you're ready to go. I'm going to start.
Hopefully y'all can hear me.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Hey, so I'm going to start. Hey, this is my second talk, the hyperdimensional deep reality of real intelligence. And so I'm using the term real intelligence to say, look, humans are real intelligent, and to distinguish between what's difference between artificial intelligence and real intelligence. So this is sort of the basis of this talk, but also it's part of the story of my book, the Deep Reality book that's going to be coming out hopefully in the next month or so. And so, see here. Okay, so here's my moniker. You've seen some of this already. I've been programming for over 50 years. I was chairman of the VisComp 92 and 94 conference, and there was also a 1981 and a 1996 version of those conferences. And Richard Feynman was the keynote speaker for the 81 conference. And a lot of those proceedings can be found online, like I said, if people want, either the 81 is in the conference proceedings. And so I've given a lot of talks and a lot of patents and papers, and did my PhD in quantum computing. Mike was one of the contributors to supporting me on that project, and also worked on neural and quantum computing with $1 million SBIR grant in the early 2000s after graduation. So, and of course, some of the work I'm going to be showing you today is Bill Tiller's work, and he's a Stanford professor emeritus who is working on sort of what he calls psychoenergetics, and we'll talk about some of those things today as well. So here's the abstract. Humans have very specific behaviors that represent the true nature of our real intelligence, and that is beyond any classical physics. And so when those requirements are analyzed for common representation and underlying design, then real intelligence is vastly different than the approach taken by artificial intelligence community. So the key difference is artificial intelligence built on classical computing and neural assumptions, while real intelligence is built on quantum bits based on a non-metric protospaces, I'm going to call it, where meaning emerges, and we're going to talk about meaning. So this leads to a complete re-examination of humans as quantum minds, and we're going to talk about the subject in this paper. So source science, I call this topic source science, and it's because it's the science of where things come from. And I believe it's from the bits. And Richard Feynman says, you know, the world is classical, damn it, it's not quantum mechanical. So let's build on that. And John Wheeler says it from bit. Richard Feynman says it's quantum mechanical. Ralph Landauer says, you know, energy, you can't erase information without violating entropy. So even black holes, you throw information into a black hole, no energy or matter, but just information, and it shows up as the smallest increment to a black hole that you can get. So essentially bits are physical. They have an effective energy and effective mass, if you want to think about that translation. And so reality is really hyperdimensional. And we've talked about this last time. These are the premises of the book I'm writing. And we've talked about some of this stuff already the last time. But this time we're going to talk about item number 3. Thoughts are quantum things, not in the brain. And which means that Descartes' assumption that mind cannot affect the physical world is false. Remember, it was an assumption, not a law. So some of the stuff we're going to present for you today that you might have seen or might not have seen is that thoughts are really informational things, and attentions can affect the physical world. How is that possible? And thoughts can directly affect what we call PK devices, psychokinesis devices. And so we believe that's due to changing the order in a non-closed system. So we're going to show you how a non-physical mind can influence order and disorder, okay? I like the saying quantum mechanics is the dreams that stuff is made of, and that's kind of a t-shirt slogan, but I like it. So what would you say the approach I'm taking? Well, it's the physics of thought. That's one way to talk about it. You could also think of it as the math of thought, but I'll put it as the physics of thought. So the paradigm is we must have a thought independent of the brain. We'll show you why that is in a minute here. And we must be compatible with quantum theories because, again, we're going to build this on a quantum theory because no classical theory can solve this problem. And we must make testable predictions, which we're going to do. So information requirements. Well, we're turning the abstract into the concrete. Well, that's pretty much what quantum mechanics does. So you have computer science, quantum physics, you're turning information. We see this in our simulators all the time. In our virtual reality environments, all the online gaming systems is about a 3D rendered virtual reality that doesn't exist anywhere. It's completely simulated, and yet we can do that. So what does it take to do that? Well, we have to have a processing environment that has memory and processing ability. It has to be massively parallel and scalable. And online gaming systems do that. They figure out how to take thousands of players and put them in an environment where they look like they're all interacting. And it must be compatible with the information and entropy theory. So those are the requirements. So what are the intelligence requirements? Well, they must support all levels of intelligence, from DNA, like as in Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenic resonance, to cells, to animals, to humans, and to what I would call infinite intelligence. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a meeting. In other words, is there a limit to the level of intelligence that you can have? Must support learning and knowing. You know, this is a big thing. Must have abstraction and the ability to build language. So those are kind of, those other two items are related. But also must have meaning in all domains, including math, logic, emotions. I call emotions meaning-based rather than chemical-based, so that it all ties together here. So, and it must have quantum physics requirements. They must have hyperdimensional representation, because we know from last time that bits, qubits, and e-bits are all built on this hyperdimensional substrate. In fact, e-bits wouldn't work unless they were all orthogonal to all others, otherwise they would interact. So we must support this out of space-time interactions, this e-bit, this non-locality, and I call this a non-metric space-time, but it's hyperdimensional. We have to kind of integrate both of those requirements. And so it must support this entanglement and the quantum speedup. And we'll talk about quantum speedup in a minute here. So notice all of this, we didn't talk about consciousness yet. And finally, when we talk about metaphysics requirements, we say, well, somehow humans can tap into this, and they have a direct awareness of any star, where star is anywhere, anywhen, anything, nowhere, no when, and nothing. And so what we're going to do is, and we must be able to affect things as well, and support what I would call lucid and transcendent states. So you say, well, how can this be the physics? Well, we have to have a model that can support transcendent states, because people have transcendent states all the time, and we just don't know how it is that it's possible to have a mathematical model to support it. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a little experiment right now for all of the people who have never done this before, what's called remote viewing. Remote viewing is just a protocol built on top of the ability for people to sense information at a remote location. So here I am in Austin right now at my desk in my office on the second story, and I have an object sitting on the desk next to me. So what you're going to look for is all of you are going to remote view, and then at the end, we'll give you a chance to write down your impressions, and then we'll show you what it is, okay? So we're going to initiate a remote viewing experiment. I originally did this 45 years ago. And when I first did this, somebody had an object sitting hidden in a container, and I said, what is it? To describe what it was. And I drew lines, horizontal lines, a bunch of horizontal lines. I drew a rectangle, and then I drew another rectangle that was rotated so it looked like a diamond, and I put red on it. And that was the impressions that came to my mind. This was back in the late 70s. And it turns out it was a box of diamond matches. So I had picked up all of the symbolic categories of the object, even though I couldn't name it. There's an example of where remote viewing, you get things symbolically, not in language. And you get things as modalities. We're going to talk about that too. So I'm suggesting that you can all take 10 seconds here right now, quiet your mind down, and give me the impressions of this object that's sitting on Doug's desk, and we'll review it at the end. So here's our little experiment that we're going to do at the end of the talk, okay? So why do I think of all of this stuff as the physics of thought? Well, it turns out everybody's working on quantum computing now. People are spending billions and billions of dollars worldwide on doing quantum computing. And why is that? Because in 1994, Peter Short created his algorithm that showed that you can solve factoring of two prime numbers using a quantum algorithm, using a quantum computer that you can do in polynomial time. And that's a speed up compared to any possible classical algorithm. And they finally realized that if you have 50 bits, 50 qubits, that you can't simulate 50 qubits anymore. 50 qubits is too big to simulate using a classical computer. And so they call this, they give them a name for this, quantum supremacy, which is the quantum supremacy is reached when you can build a quantum computer that can solve a problem that no classical computer could ever solve. And they're currently building computers of this size right now. So they're at the point of showing that quantum computers can do this. In fact, here's the physical machines built by all these companies. They're all super cooled quantum computers, and they're all using a variety of technologies. But one of the things you got to realize is, why is quantum supremacy, why does it work when we can't solve this classically? And the reason is the universe is quantum mechanically, damn it. And the quantum mechanics is cheating because it's using actual physical dimensions, these dimensions that we don't have access to in the physical world, in the 3D world. If you have 2 to the 100th dimensions that are all orthogonal to each other, they can't fit in our 3D world. So they must fit somewhere, and it's this abstract mathematical space that is real, and yet somehow quantum computers can tap into this, okay? And so, in fact, everybody who's working on quantum computing, not a lot of people working on quantum computing and neural computing, and a lot of them think maybe it's because we want to be able to build high performance computing that are valuable, and they think AI technology, who knows, maybe quantum technology and AI will help each other, that you could build a quantum AI, you know. And so all these companies are working, and as you can see, they have over 50 qubit machines now, and that's why Google thinks that they've beat the quantum supremacy limit, okay? But one of the things that you should realize that everybody's working on quantum computing, other kinds of high performance computing like FPGA computing and stuff like that, and then this neuromorphic computing, which is the term that IBM uses for their work in neural computing, okay? So just realize that both of these are related to hyperdimensional math models, okay? So if you don't know anything about hyperdimensional math models, either in quantum or neural, then you're kind of missing the technology boat here that all of these people are working on, okay? So let's talk about dimensionality. Turns out there's it's a thing on Wikipedia called cursive dimensionality. And just like the number of states for the qubits grow, the number of weighted subsets can grow exponentially if you have n features or d features for the number of dimensions. So you have 2 to the d weighted subsets, okay? And the problem is humans tend to be able to cluster things so that we know which dimensions to include or exclude. In fact, usually in an AI system, we have to manually tell which clustering techniques to use because it's hard to find clusters if you don't know which dimensions you can exclude. So we give it hints usually about that, okay? And the reason is because there's no efficient hyperdimensional algorithm that's equivalent to radar or sonar, which is I can compute what's near me that's low energy and low cost computationally to do that. That's not proportional to the size of the space. Okay, so efficient, if you had to, in order to map any sonar or radar, let's say radar, you had to map the entire world to get any of it, it would be too slow. So here's an example. You have a locally efficient version of radar sonar. We would call that a clustering algorithm, okay? But one of the things you start doing when you get to this, and see, here's an example of an n-dimensional hypercube, okay? Notice as that this is rotating it at different perspectives, but notice if this was a true hyperdimensional unit cube, 4-dimensional unit cube, that all these sides should be the same length. But as I rotate it, I can't map it into 3 dimensions because 4 dimensions doesn't fit in 3 dimensions. The best I can do is give you a shadow of it as I'm rotating it, okay? So, but the point is non-intuitive geometry, which leads to probabilistic geometry. We're going to go into that in a minute. And the points spread out in the hypervolume on surface and corners, okay? Which is also related to what happens on a black hole. Essentially, all the volume of a black hole is on its surface area. And you can show that mathematically as well as at the physics of it, okay? So the point is there's these what we call distance measures, but it turns out if you are in a space, a high dimensional space, you can't truly have an energy metric and a distance metric. So this metric, even though it's the same math, it's really a similarity measure, and you can show how the similarity measure is similar to the inner product. In other words, all of these measures can be turned into each other. So searching for answers in an infinite dimensional space requires massive parallelism, and that's kind of what humans do, apparently. So let's talk about these quantum states and how they're probably related to simulating the universe, because these quantum states probably existed before the universe did. If we're going to have a Big Bang, they say, what preceded the Big Bang? Well, it's a low entropy state, okay? So where did that all come from? So the classical world must emerge from quantum states, and the simulation is separate from the simulator. We all know if we're flying a flight simulator, we're not aware of the computer underneath it, except if it's not working correctly, okay? So here's a tongue-in-cheek cartoon about this subject. Dilbert, the cartoon Dilbert, he's an egghead engineer, and he says, I created a simulated world made entirely of software, and I programmed all the people in the simulation to think they are real people with free will. Are they sentient beings? Oh, they think they are. And what if they discover their true nature? And he says, well, I programmed limits to their physics so they can never observe the walls of their reality. For example, they can't get to the edge of their universe because they can't exceed the speed of light, and they can't find out what they are made of because to them, it looks like probability at the quantum level. Wouldn't those limits tip off the smart ones? I coded them not to trust smart people. Well, this is very funny and very, at so many levels. I love this cartoon, this is why I put it here. But it basically says, look, I can simulate people and the universe. It's kind of like this, the Matrix. That was all the whole movie about the Matrix. But the problem is, in order to support a simulation, you have to have enough computational infrastructure to efficiently do that. And if you're simulating or quantum mechanical, then you have to have a quantum computer to do it with. You can't simulate it in a classical computer. So the joke is on Dilbert here, because he can't simulate it purely in software because he doesn't have the right kind of hardware to do it. And in fact, in the movie, they talk about there is no spoon. Well, I tell you, as an engineer, I'm applying my thoughts to what we're doing here, thoughts and intention and things like that. This is my collection of bent spoons that I personally bend. I do this routinely on conference talks that I give. And one time we had everybody in the class, 45 people, who got spoons that I gave them to them, and 3 of them bent them. So the point is this notion that mind and physics are related. Yeah, they are, but you can't have this notion of the universe is sitting on top of a turtle, right? The world sitting on top of a turtle, and then what's below that turtle on? Well, another turtle, and it's turtles all the way down, right? The problem with that model is that each turtle is another classical layer, just like the one above it. Well, that's not true in our universe. Our universe says we have a quantum layer below that, and that quantum infrastructure has its own computational capabilities in it, okay? So there is no classical tower of turtles. There's this discrepancy where now we cross the quantum divide, okay? So here is some of the requirements. All these simulators require computational resources. I would call that the implicate, okay? The state, which is a proto-state, it doesn't exist, space-time doesn't exist yet, okay? Change, some proto-time resource. Those changes are instantaneous because there's no time frame for them to exist in, okay? And the rules, well, the rules are just in which state and change interact. I would call this verb nouns. In other words, it's a state that can act as an operator and vice versa, okay? Abstraction, how do you build wholeness and complexity? How does that emerge, okay? Scalability, how is there enough resources to simulate for the scope and speed for the whole multiverse? How is there enough resources to do that, okay? So the quantum proto-dimensions are this infrastructure, there's my play on words there, So 4D spacetime emerges from this ND proto-spacetime, okay? The topology and built-in verb noun operators is the root of all laws. So that is the geometric algebra stuff that we were talking about. And all the stuff from the last talk, that's the operations that are possible inside this system, okay? Aggregation of space-like concurrent states. So this multi-vector notion that you can keep adding states and adding states and adding states, but those states have no mass, they have no energy, they're just abstract mathematical bits, right? And so you can aggregate those without limit and not exceed any black hole limit, okay? And that's important. But yet energy becomes manifest. For example, if you have a computer and you're simulating a nuclear event, either an atomic bomb blast or a supernova, and you're simulating that, the computer that it's running the simulation in doesn't melt due to the simulation, but yet in our universe, we can simulate energy. If it's a simulation, now all of a sudden energy becomes manifest and it actually does something in our universe, but it doesn't destroy the environment where the simulation is running in. So I would say thinking about nuclear events and separating the notion of a simulator from the result of the simulation is an important idea to think about. So matter is probably frozen energy. You know, this is unitary versus nilpotent. And so what does it take to support all this? Well, we know how big our universe is, and we know how big all the quantum events in the E-bits and the qubits. So there's an infinity of these concurrent proto-dimensions and change capability that's part of this infrastructure that must be there to run the entire universe. And that's the basis for Shor's algorithm, quantum supremacy, and I would argue the real intelligence, what we call savants, the infinite intelligence kinds of, on the scale of infinite intelligence. How do we do that, okay? So I say that real intelligence is quantum based, and we are intelligent and informational, but how? Well, AI assumes that our mind is a classical brain. It's called the myth of AI. Engineers want to replicate intelligence in hardware software. That's the Turing test. And the successes of artificial intelligent machine learning show that neural networks and machine learning are useful, except they don't really know how they really work. They say, well, this trick works, but the failure of AI, of course, is due to that there's no meaning or general learning in any of this. I mean, you may have a computer that can beat you in chess, but it doesn't know the meaning of chess and the meaning of these moves and the meaning of the pieces. It's just, it's a shell game essentially, of moving bits around, okay? But our real intelligence demonstrates that our mind is quantum based. And it's why? Because we probably need a representation that is hyperdimensional, some of these bit dimensions. And we know, again, from Wheeler, information is physical. So if we have these hyperdimensional states, how could humans and biology and life naturally build itself from these bit dimensions, okay? And even Sir Roger Penrose states that the mind is non-computational. It says it's not something that you can compute using classical computing ideas, okay? So somehow mind taps into this quantum speed up and these space-like states. And so these are important requirements, and I would call that the savant intelligence. And so I would say that mind is outside space-time. I'm going to give you some examples of why I say that. So mind is really like the same stuff that makes up the quantum system. And so we represent the source code of the universe, and we can see that's showing up in some experiments where essentially the mind, which is quote supposed to be in the universe, is affecting the simulator that runs the universe. So that's why it's important to have the simulator analogy to realize that we've crossed the divide when we do that. So, and we can show you how meaning naturally emerges from these hyperdimensional spaces. Correlatives, we're going to talk about that in a minute here. So what does that mean? The brain is probably a 3D antenna. In Bill Tiller's language and William Tiller's language, he calls it a biobody suit. Just like if you're in, scuba diving, you need a scuba suit. Well, we have a biobody suit to interact with 3D reality. And because our mind really isn't 3D reality. So why? So notice we didn't say anything about consciousness here. This is real intelligence. It says real intelligence is more meaningful than AI because we actually emerge meaning out of this. So there can never be a singularity. The experiment, the Terminator series, that says we have machines that are smarter than humans and they evolve faster than humans. I don't believe that's going to happen. And there's other people who also don't believe it's happened. But here's the reason why it wasn't going to happen, because there is no classical turtle tower out there. That this quantum layer is a new infrastructure. And that's the same thing happened to physics. Physics said, look, we have this quantum layer and it's completely different than the classical layer. And physicists have been struggling with that forever since, okay? So what is this infrastructure for the quantum model? Well, we have to know that it's related to entropy and information. So we know we have bits, and we know that the initial state of the pre-universe was this very low entropy quantum states. And we've talked about, you can take two states, 2 bits, and you can combine them using the coin demo, that all of a sudden information is created. So if you can cluster dimensions, the clustering itself may be an energy releasing and information releasing property. So now all of a sudden, now you can say, okay, we could bootstrap the universe, and you can say, well, why is this possible? This violates energy. Well, it's because we're not in space-time yet. So we would see this as what I would call a neg entropy source, which is a lot of what consciousness is going to do is, and intelligence is going to do, and intention is going to do, is affect the entropy of some other part of the system. And we can do that if we're part of the source code of the universe. We can reach into any other part of the system and change it. Okay, so this is the model we're working with. So, and these quantum states are the topological protobits, you know, and all this true concurrency exists that we talked about last time. We have an infinity of these orthonormal bits. They're part of the implicate. True concurrency exists. In other words, A plus B plus C, if that's a photon, just as we start moving relativistically, the photon doesn't disappear. In a sense, it's not a photon anymore, because that plus means simultaneousness. And so you got to have a true notion of simultaneity outside of relativity in order for all of this to work. And by the way, Hilbert space does the same thing. It assumes that plus doesn't change as you go through relativistic changes for these quantum states, okay? So these probabilities are fundamental, and all space-time is from this quantum foam. All space-time, matter, and energy emerges from quantum foams. Again, I'm collecting requirements here. If we were to have a quantum model for the mind, what are the requirements? And these are the requirements. And that not only the quantum field theory comes from this model, but I would say the mind is also. That's why we call it source science. It's the science, the source of both of those. And we must have the quantum speed up and the quantum supremacy requirement in there, okay? But the other thing is, entanglement is ubiquitous. We talked about that last time. We talked about how space itself is probably entangled due to Tauquirnians, and that dark matter and dark energy are probably entangled, and that you can't simulate a 4D universe inside 4D dimensions inside 3D universe. So to the point about people saying, well, I don't understand physics about our model for geometric algebra because we haven't embedded it in space-time yet. Well, the people who do embed it in space-time don't understand quantum entanglement, because you can't represent quantum entanglement inside 3D. So there's the rebuff for the comment about not understanding physics. Well, which part of physics aren't you understanding? Okay, so the truly concurrent space-like states are underlying all of physics. Those space-like states are required. That's the A plus B plus C. And if you add a fourth one, D, which is the space-like states that you have to support entanglement too. And you get this non-local because you have a 4D space trying to map it into 3D, and you can't do that, okay? So you're trying to simulate this 3D universe, and here's a box that represents our 3D universe, and here's a higher dimensional space that's simulating this 3D universe. This kind of reminds you of all the simulators that are going on in the virtual reality systems in the world right now. But this is also the kind of box that Chris Doran built. He built a ray tracing software using geometric algebra that they're using in simulators like this, and they can do real-time efficient ray tracing using geometric algebra. And they don't have to post-process the light beams. They can have a single candle here, and they can simulate it, ray tracing the light in this whole area efficiently using geometric algebra without specialized hardware. And so his company was bought by ARM to embed his software in simulators. So again, all of this is computational, simulation oriented, and you have to figure out how to do all this efficiently. Well, the universe has figured out how to do this, okay? So the reasons for the quantum mind, well, humans, real intelligence exhibit significant non-classical behaviors. So now we're switching more from the requirements to the another important requirement, significant non-classical behaviors. Again, we're reminding you that AI is just, it's the myth of AI. There is no generalized learning or meaning. And the failure of AI, they've been saying, we're going to have truly intelligent machines in 10 years from now, and they've been saying that for 60 years. Plus, they've gotten a big scoop, a boost from the semiconductor scaling that's been going on at the same time, and they still haven't got truly intelligent machines within 10 years. And the limits of semiconductors that are going to stop scaling in the next 10 years. And they can't get below 1 atom thick for transistors. You know, it doesn't work as a transistor anymore. So all of these things are important. Plus, normal intelligence requires learning, meaning, genius, savant, and infinite intelligence. We don't have any way of dealing with models like that, okay? So thoughts, memory, and experiences without a brain. Wait a minute, you can have thoughts, memory, and experiences without a brain? Yeah, we'll show you examples. Single cells are examples of it, near-death experiences of it, and we're going to talk about intention host devices in a minute here. So that's part of the research that William Tiller did, okay? So how can you have direct awareness and knowing of the universe? Talk about, again, these are requirements that people have these behaviors. They're significant non-classical behaviors. And intention, there's all this PK research out there done by the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Group and their affiliates and various groups, Global Consciousness Project, the Double Slit Experiment. We're going to talk about some of these in a minute here. So somehow awareness and intention bypasses space and time as a barrier. So how is that possible? We could see it not as a physical object, but as a barrier due to the mechanics of space and time. That's what space and time is doing. It's keeping things from all being connected. So, but quantum systems tend to make things all connected, especially if you have entanglement there. So ultimately, all systems are open to mental observer. And plus you want to have these understanding of knowing, not data, knowing and meaning and lucidity and transcendent states. And even consciousness is probably an emergent property that's probably space-like. At least that's what Mike Manthey believes. But I believe these other things are much more concrete to talk about than just pure consciousness, and the consciousness conference that's been going on for the last 25 years. Okay, so we would call our model a dualistic model. You could say it's also related to panpsychism, but it's only if you're focusing on the consciousness aspect of it. I'm talking about the computational level aspect of it. So the mind is made of these computational states, and that they inform the rest of the universe using a quantum version of the Matrix movie, and that we can observe anything, any star. Remember this list of any star I put down here in the bottom, and appears to make any change, okay? So I believe this bit physics is a combinatoric hierarchy. It's a true hyperdimensional concurrency of non-metric space-like states. And you have to know that it's space-like, and we can talk about that in the sense that it's the world line, and it's outside that can be reached by, and it's outside that we can be reached by light or by particles, okay? And so it's space-like states, that's what that means, okay? And these proto-dimensions and states are not matter, they're not energy, they're not in space, and they're not in time. In fact, they construct space-time, matter, and energy, okay? So, and they have this multiple concurrency, okay? So this here is the reasons why we have the quantum mind, but now we're going to be giving you a more detailed look at this non-classical behavioral matrix that we were just talking about. These significant non-classical effects that humans can do, that our artificial intelligence systems can do, and as long as we ignore these things, then we're not really solving the problem, okay? So there's clairvoyance, clairaudience, and clairsentience. And you can think of this as a term called ROTES, R-O-T-E-S. That's a term by Robert Monroe, and he basically was an astral traveler. He would do remote viewing and out-of-body experiences, and he would say anytime he thought of a thought, or you could do it in remote viewing as well, you get a thought, you say, give me the answer to this question. A little packet of information would show it. It would be like an internet packet, but it would be of the mind. And this rote, he calls it a rote, and he believes rotes are hierarchical meaning systems. They do have rotes built on other rotes, and essentially it's symbolically encoded information for the mind, and that's the basis for telepathy and a lot of other things. So he's coined that term, and I like it. And you can think of it as rotes outside of space, but also outside of time. So I've organized this chart here by information, space, and time. And then energy is if there's an effect on the physical part of the universe, then I use the term energy, or entropy is that last column, okay? But essentially there's this thing called remote staring and presentience. Essentially remote staring says somebody can at an unconscious or conscious level know that they're being stared at. Well, how is that possible, okay? So it requires this is non-local in space, and it can also be non-local in time. And it can have an unconscious level. You can say it's physiology, but it could also be at the prana level, that the prana, which is the subtle energy body of the human that pre-informs the body how to be its physical self. It's just the same thing as the morphogenic resonance for the DNA, that somehow that these experiments are real and we must have a model to explain them, okay? Perception, once we have this awareness, then we have perception. I also believe that this table is all true, and particularly the Anu, and we'll talk about that in a minute, the occult chemistry stuff. But I know medical tuition. By the way, I know people who can do all these things that we're going to cover here, and I can do some of them myself. And some of the people in this group probably also can do this, and I'm just not shy about talking about it. Okay. So here part, I have a friend who's a healer. Says one day she started getting downloads of mathematical information into her, and she asked them to send it to somebody else who was more appropriate for it. So how can you have thoughts? It's like, how can you have chunks of information, these rotes that contain information? It's like, well, it's because mathematics are their own form, and they're their own rotes, and you can tap into them like you could by picking them up as a book in a library. So people tap into this stuff as thoughts. So this is why I said the physics of thoughts, because all of this is related to thoughts. And, but we also know that if you're in the zone, you're an athlete and you're in the zone and you say, how were you able to do that shot? And he says, well, it looked like everybody was just moving in slow motion. So you get in this zone state and you can process like you're a supercomputer faster than anybody else, such that they look like they're going in slow motion. But all of these are part of these transcendent states that we have to figure out, well, what's a model that can solve all these problems? Specifically, telepathy is part of this model. And so it's thoughts, rotes. These are things are all related. Thoughts, essentially rotes are tiny little packets, automata of thoughts that are used in remote viewing and used in the experiment that we're going to do at the end here. I asked you to go get information and it would show up as a rote in your unconscious, and you have to sort of like do a quantum measurement on it. You have to ask what information was in the rote without producing your prejudice in it, which would be like taking a quantum measurement without affecting the quantum state in a way that you lose the information in it. So this is an important relationship between quantum thought and quantum computing, in the sense rotes are like these high dimensional states that you have to turn into sequential thought very carefully, otherwise you destroy them, okay? So, but there's all these PK effects, and we're going to be talking about some of these in next, because there's some significant ones here that are very important, okay? These behaviors, the non-classical behaviors, are the hard problem of real intelligence. So it's not just the hard problem of consciousness, it's the hard problem of real intelligence, and skeptics ignore most of these things. And they says, well, this can't happen, so we're just going to ignore it. But there's significant research in all of this area, and anybody who can be trained to do this stuff, including remote viewing, they found that anybody can do remote viewing. So we're going to take one little mathematical survey here, segue here that we didn't cover last time. We're going to talk about content addressable memories. Okay, imagine that you have a memory where you can address it by the address forms the address in a high dimensional space becomes the data itself. The address is the data. So how would you build a system like that? A guy named Pentti Kanerva originally coined this term back in the 80s. And so I've been aware of his work since the 80s, okay? So let's say you take, this is content addressable memories 101, okay? Pick a random point in three-dimensional space. It's easy. You have an X and a Y and a Z axis, and this is in a unit cube. So you have a value between 0 and 1 3 times. You pick another random point in 100-dimensional space. So instead of having 3 values between 0 and 1, you have 100 values between 0 and 1. And by the way, you can easily do this inside Excel spreadsheet. You can take 100 columns, and you can say, generate a random number for each one of those cells, and you can simulate this in Excel, which we've done. Now you take a second point in each of the space, and you compute the distance. And you can pick many more points, randomly pick points between 0 and 1 for each of the dimensions. And if you do this, you end up getting a curve that looks like this, okay? Notice that there is a distribution because it's random, and it has a mean, and it has an average, essentially, okay? And if you do this, and you can compute the distance between any 2 points that you've randomly picked. So it's not just an ordered thing, you get this statistics, okay? But as you find out, as the number of dimensions grow up, the shape of this curve does not change, because the randomness just gives you the same distribution all the time. But since you have more dimensions, the distance between them is expanding out. So by the time you get up to here, the points in the space look like they're spread out, but there's very few points near them in the space, okay? And so this is the notion of correlations, correlational algorithms. This is the work that I did, that I got the SBIR contract for. You can show that you can have a midpoint M in the unit cube, and if you have a Euclidean distance between P and Q, this mean here, if you have it greater than 20, you can see that it's the square root of n over 6. And we've proved with Mathematica, this is an exact answer. Okay, if you do it statistically, you get a probability. But if you do it significant enough, this goes to this limit. And the standard deviation of this is the square root of 7 over 120. It's independent of n, which, as you'd expect, if you could normalize this respect to n, that the standard deviation, if you said the standard distance, you removed n out of it, you divided it by n, and then you divided this by n too, that the standard deviation is related to 1 over n. And that's what we see here, okay? But you can also take the midpoint of a space. If you think that there's a midpoint of the space and you have these two distances, you can also compute the distance at the n, that you find out there's this thing called the standard radius, which is n over 12. And it has a standard deviation of 1 over 60, square root of 1 over 60, okay? So, and of course these square roots come in here because we're using the Euclidean distance metrics, which is the sum of the squares, the square root of the sum of the squares, okay? And for big N, this distance, or the distance and radius, are literally constants. You can treat this like a normalization metric, an intrinsic normalization metric, based on this kind of space that you're doing. It's similar to a light year, okay? And in correlations are known as these content addressable memories, or sparse distributed coding. They're related to CDMA. In fact, we'll show you in the next slide here, it's related to spread spectrum. And so it's like we're a computing environment for spread spectrum. Okay, so this is the math related to this. But with this is the mathematics for the emergence of meaning, that the data, the bits, is the address, okay? So we can show you that if you were to take, this is a probabilistic geometry here. We look at a little ball and stick model that says if you have a midpoint of the space and you picked, let's say n is 100, and you put, it doesn't make any difference here, this is independent of n, and you picked a bunch of points P and a bunch of points Q, and you computed the distance between any 2 points P and Q, you would find out that the raw distance looks like n over 6, and the square root of n over 6, and the distance to the radius is the square root of n over 12. So if you compute all these other distance metrics, you can find that they look like this. And if you normalize this respect to the radius, now you find that this is sort of like a unit sphere or a unit hypercube. It's actually like an equilateral triangle, a hyperdimensional version of a tetrahedron. Okay, so these points are all equal distance from the radius, from the midpoint of the space, and this distance here is the square root of 2. What that means is that if you normalize with the standard radius, then you end up with this is 1, and this is square root of 2. Well, that means this is a right triangle. all these angles in here are right triangles, and these right triangles, it becomes near orthogonal. As n gets higher and higher and higher, then they're becoming more and more orthogonal. So randomness gives orthogonal spaces, orthogonal dimensions. So this is equivalent to matrix math in the sense that you can do everything in matrix math that you could do here, but you're using near orthogonal spaces, knowing that you have randomly generated points in the space, okay? And so you can think of these points in the space are like these vectors. They're like computed by all the bits that form it. You can think of it as a giant vector, and any two vectors that are randomly generated are 90 degrees from each other, and you can have plus and minus. So this looks like a macroscopic version of qubits. Instead of having one bit to deal with, you're dealing with hundreds or thousands or millions of bits to give this vector mathematics, okay? So big thought vectors are built from these small bit vectors, and they're orthogonal in hyperdimensional spaces. So related thoughts are really less than 90 degrees, but random thoughts are, so imagine that there's a phase angle here, and that you can have a thought that's, because some attributes of this thought is related to the attributes of another thought, then its content is similar, and it would be less than 90 degrees, okay? So how do we build meaning using these correlatives, it turns out? By the way, we patented something here, and I'll show you that in a minute. So first of all, this is true for any hyperdimensional space of any cell type. We did it for bits, qubits, e-bits. They're self-normalizing using the standard distance and standard radius, kind of like the qubit unitarity constraint. So you can normalize everything with respect to this built-in metric. And you can say it's Boolean complete and Turing complete. So you can have an infinite number of these dimensions. And if you look at any two of them, they're orthogonal to each other. But yet you can't embed this in a high dimensional space. So not only can't embed qubits into a high dimensional space, you can't embed this into a high dimensional space, and you can't compute the clustering of this efficiently because there's no high dimensional version of sonar or radar that can be dimensions. So again, it's Boolean complete, it's Turing complete. These orthogonal thought vectors are random from the middle of the space, and a meaning emerges from this space like addresses. You can think of this point in this high dimensional space as a mental observer frame. So thought vectors exist in this random non-metric space, and distance represents the correlation, not a distance metric, and it's equivalent to the inner product. So what you can do is you can think, if I have a point in the space, imagine if you had a dartboard on it and somebody threw a dart at it and it landed in a bullseye. And then with their eyes closed, they threw another dart and it landed inside this area. Well, that's highly unlikely mathematically. So anytime you see 2 points near each other in a hyperdimensional space, knowing that random points are never near each other, then you know that this is an information content. And we can compute the information content for space. And it's done in this book, Correlative Object Books, that's out there, correlational algorithms book that's out there. And we show all the mathematics for you. You can order that on Amazon. And we did that book as part of that contract 15 years ago. So highly unlikely vectors represent neg entry. So this bullseye analogy. So points that are right here are standard distance apart. Points that are near here look like this. And so you have emergence of probabilities and superposition for thought vectors, you know, and you get these nearness that looks like a clustering version of radar and sonar. And of course, we can't simulate that very well, but you can mathematically represent this, and you can then do hierarchical meaning using this. So this looks like the kind of chart that we did is if you could say which points are near me and how far are they, and you can look like this. This is called the vortex and the bullseye of the law of attraction. The mathematics generates this vortex exactly like that. Okay. So correlative supremacy, not just quantum supremacy, but correlative supremacy for real intelligence is again because we're using an actual versus a simulated hyperdimensional space. So if we actually had a hyperdimensional space like the one that supports bit quantum computing, then we could have correlative supremacy, and humans would be much smarter if they use this representation than if they were using a classical brain model. Because you can't simulate a hyperdimensional space efficiently, okay? So that's why it's important to think of the brain as an antenna rather than the computer, okay? So here's the last thing that we patented on the correlatives, and this is important because we start out with what's called uniform phase ensembles. Generally, when you're working with qubits, you have 100 or 1,000. Usually you started out in NMR qubits where they were liquids. And so they would get more gain out of them by having ensembles where everything was the same, and they would get gain from the measurement by having them all the same, okay? But here what we're going to do is we're going to take two ensembles, X and Y, and each of them has 1,000 qubits, all with random phase. So what does that mean? If you have 1,000 qubits and they all have a random phase between 0 and 90, that means that there's just going to be just as many uniform phase. There's going to be just as many at phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 3 up through phase 90. There's going to be a uniform distribution of phases between 0 and 90. And there's going to be on an average 100 at each one of those, okay? And it looks just like a line, uniform phase. So we call these uniform phase ensembles, and nobody would ever tend to build ensembles this way using regular quantum computing, but you would if you were using correlatives. So now you can take a second set of measurements, x and little y ensembles, again, each with random phase. But you're going to save that phase because essentially this phase is coming from the sort of the structure of the brain, okay? So we're going to think about that in a minute about what that means, okay? So remember all those starting phases and repeat in each trial. So repeatedly measure x with little x. So you're going to say, I'm going to compute the phase of this first state, qubit 0, with a phase, I'm going to measure it with respect to the phase of little x, okay? And so I'm going to get an answer, and I'm going to get probability, okay? I'm going to get the answer 0 or 1, and I'm going to do the same thing. And if I measure these repeatedly, I'm going to find that if I do this, the distance between this resulting measure and this resulting measure, since they both are starting out with the same value, it's just another occurrence of it, is 70% of standard distance. Whereas the distance between this and y is standard distance. And it shows up like this, where the right-hand side of this graph is standard distance. And it shows that you can easily distinguish these two x's and y's, even though everything's random, because it's repeatable. And so the brain is doing this repeatability. It's saying the brain structure creates that tokens in the brain can cross across the barrier. They are noisy, but they're still distinguishable from each other because everything else is maximally far away, okay? And the higher the number of dimensions you have, the more, just like we saw the standard distance, it becomes narrower and narrower and easily to discriminate, okay? So you can distinguish X and Y even though they're random phases. And there's a patent out there. It was issued. Now it's lapsed. So that means this is in the open public domain here now because the company that patented it went out of business, okay? But this was my patent and based on that contract that we did. So you can think of this as each X and Y is a cluster. And if you repeatedly generate them and you take measurements with them, you're going to get points. Even the answer is a correlative. And you're going to see that this cluster is closer to each other than this cluster in the sense that they're more correlated with each other because they're out at the same value, but they're much farther away than the standard distance to the other cluster. So this is the mechanism for quantum mind interacting with antenna brain, because now you can have each brain create its own set of quantum states, and then it becomes a unique set of tokens that allows you to bootstrap the brain and mind so that they start talking to each other. So this is an important patent, and that's why I'm presenting it here so that you understand that this is an important part of the, so what is the real intelligent substrate? Propose that thoughts are quantum dimensions. Then thoughts have these properties. They are formed by these, they scale arbitrarily, they are maximally concurrent, they have these rotes and the meaning emergence from the correlatives. They allow the brain-mind interface using this correlatives. Attention is choosing a proto-space address. Think of it as a hyper-observer frame. Space is space-like, everything, meaning, attention, awareness, intention, knowing, consciousness, they're all space-like. So they must exist outside of space-time, which means you have survival. The mind is not in the brain. And intention and telepathy are built on these entangled states. You could call those Akka chords if you're a psychic person. And it supports lucidity and transcendent states because you're stepping out of time. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute here. So next slides, we sort of propose the model here, and the same thing as in the book, but now we're going to give you some real examples. I kind of put the examples last, put the theory first, put the examples last, okay? So here's the awareness of the quantum states. We're going to call this the awareness property. This is an experiment that William Tiller did. he took a prism, put light through it, and put a voltage plates on both sides of the prism, high voltage source. And what he would do is, using voltage, he would cause these, what he calls the mirror spectrum. Here is the normal Newtonian spectrum, Newton, because he was the first one who sort of documented that the light splits this way in a prism. But that you can basically take a person who has auric vision, and you can scroll up into these with a tube like this, so you can see which angle they're looking at, and you can find these mirror spectrum up there. These aren't actual spectrum. They're like echoes of the spectrum that people who can see auras can see. So I would call these topologically equivalent to light, in the sense that they must have the same topological structure, but they're mirrors of them that don't actually have energy. So they have the structure without the energy, but people can become aware of those. So this work is on Tiller's website. You can see more about this, and it's in the book. Also, people can see auras. My friend and healer and telepath, Deborah Singleton, she commissioned an artist to draw this diagram here of how she sees the auric body, okay? And she's not only a healer, but she's a telepath, and she can look into this field. This is a probability cloud of thoughts, and she can go in and dissect this cloud, and it says that there is thoughts in there, and she can see what they're thinking and read about it, okay? So when she looks at me, she says, Doug, all of your thoughts have parentheses around them. And I go, that's odd, because I programmed in a language called Lisp for 15 years, and Lisp is got predominantly number of parentheses around it. Well, she didn't know that. And here it affected my thought structure you can see this stuff in the auric probability cloud, because this is bits of that. And you can see that artists have tried to represent this. You guys know this guy. This is a sculpture that's 30 meters tall in London on the Thames River, and he built this quantum cloud, and it's basically a person in there, and it's his Anthony Gormley, and I think he might have, even people in Anpa might know about him, but he's tried to show this photograph, this sculpture, 100 feet tall sculpture, trying to show this same sculpture, the same thing that Deborah showed in this thing. Also, we know from occult chemistry that people were using in the early 1920s and before then, Ledbetter and Besant, they were looking at Anu, and Anu looked like quarks. They were if you can go occult chemistry PDF online, and you can see them. They're using remote viewing down at the atomic level to look at quarks and draw these pictures of a 10-dimensional ball of string that might be equivalent to a 10-dimensional string theory. I don't know. But the fact that they could see this before quarks were even known about, 50 years before quarks were even known about. Three-way combining of these Anus. So the fact that they can do this is the Theosophical Society and occult chemistry. And plus you can see auras and orbs in pictures. These are photos of my sister's dogs, because she's quite empathetic. And so she loves animals, and you can see them showing up here as well. So this is just a sample of the stuff that's going on. I'm going to give you more here. Here's direct meaning with telepathy. So I know telepaths, and I have experienced telepathy. And a friend revealed all my thoughts with the parentheses. I told you about that story already. But I also went to the Monroe Institute for 3-week sessions, 3 separate week sessions. And one of the times, my spirit guide was giving me a lecture on essentially protophysics as tetrahedrons while I was at the Monroe Institute. So why do I think tetrahedrons are important? Because my spirit guide told me they were important. So all humans are telepathic. And I say that is because every child has meaning before words. Essentially, we know what the meaning is, and then we attach labels to it later. So what is the structure? What is the representation for this meaning? Well, I think telepathy is an important clue about how to do that. So Susie Miller has this program called Awesomism, and it's her term for her autistic children that she supports, okay? And her autistic child, not her child herself, but her clients, who are autistic children clients, taught her telepathy. They realized that she would get what they were trying to do. And so these autistic children are really advanced spiritual beings, okay? They taught her telepathy. She teaches telepathy as part of her business model, how to interact with your autistic children. because they're advanced creatures and they need to, and they don't like the physical world. It's too loud and too mean and too angry. So she wants to, they go into their own internal world and they don't interact with the physical world very well. So they use telepathy. So her telepathy is now written and spoken. Here's an example of it. I'm going to play an audio track for you. This is a session that I did.
Telepathic skills for Doug Matsey. It also came to offer this as a gift of love to you, as expressed as a gift of love from you. The script for the program, activate, run program, anchor, release.
I know you're going to have questions about that later, but if you look at that sheet there, it looks like laws of form signatures to me. It does anyhow. So how can you have thoughts and intentions without brains? I mean, that was one of my premises. And the reason is because you can have single cell creatures, amoeba, have anticipation of feeding intervals, and they don't have a brain at all. They only have as microtubules. Okay, jellyfish are cell aggregates, and so they really don't have individuated cells very much. But you also have this notion of morphogenic fields in DNA. So how can you have information without brains? Okay. Well, you can have these direct downloads we talked about. You know, you can download mathematical forms. The last time I talked about vital energy patterns, that you can basically put subtle energy on tape and in water and things like that. There's also this notion of elementary and elementals in hermetics. Hermetics basically says you can program a little automaton called an elementary or an elementals, and you can have them do your bidding. It's like a little thought virus. And you can use this as part of your spiritual practice, and they give you techniques how to do this. So again, here's like a rote, but it does things for you. It tells you about things, and those are all related to rotes. But archetypes probably are also like this. And you can also encode water, and so you can put love in water, the messages in water stuff. So how is it that you can do all this stuff? Well, you have to have a form of thought that doesn't require the brain, okay? And you can do that with Akashic records and dreams too, and the download of the mathematical forms. But you can also do channeling and walk-ins. I personally know some walk-ins, and they know they're walk-ins. And usually they're quite, these advanced teachers are knowing that they've been walked in. They weren't the original mind that was associated with this body when the brain, when the person was born, okay? So, but the other big one is the near-death experience. These are two relatively recent. Eben Alexander, he's a particular good one because he's a neurosurgeon. He was in a coma for a week with encephalitis, and his brain, he knew his brain wasn't working, and yet he comes back with all these memories. And he has a book called out there, Proof of Heaven. And Anita Morjani, she had stage 4 cancer. She was in a coma with that, and she came back and was healed. And her book is called Dying to Be Me. And so these are great examples. And they also talk about the transpersonal phenomena in there in both of those, okay? But the big one I wanted to tell you about is Tiller's team, William Tiller's team, created this intention host device. And this intention host device looks like this. It's not much more complicated literally than a garage door opener. It's a chip with an oscillator in it. That's about it. But you can program this device can carry an intention. And Tiller did that using meditation. Then he used this intention host device in a laboratory experiment to create what's called a conditioned space. He calls it a conditioned space. And he says, change the pH of water up or down by 1 degree. So instead of 7 pH, it went to 8, or from 7 down to 6, okay? And he did a couple of experiments with this. He could show that you could use a magnetic, you could put above the water and a magnetic field, and if he put the field where it was the south pole facing up, then it would meet the intention that he was doing. And if he put the North Pole facing up, it would like cancel out his thought intention. So magnetic properties somehow have an effect on thoughts. That's what he's showing here. And he's encoded thoughts in this device. He has experiments where it's going up or down based on the intention of what he programmed in the device. Okay, but he also showed that you can do the same thing. You can increase, the reason this is so valuable is because now you can do experiments that are much more not dependent on the human ability to keep his attention focused. Okay, he also did this in organic systems and living systems. You can increase the reaction rate of ALP, a liver enzyme, and you can also change the reproductivity rate of living fruit fly larvae. So these are all experiments that are going to be talked about in the book, but is also available on his website. So realize that as soon as you have the ability to store intention not in the brain, then you have to have a model for how that's possible. Okay, and that's what these vital energy patterns were that we talked about in the last time I was at Anpa. Okay, so here, getting to the close to the end here, so some key mind interactions with quantum states. And these are the significant PK experiments. Dean Radin did a double slit experiment where he built a device. It was an encapsulated double slit experiment, and he would allow people to concentrate on it or relax on it. And people could do this either directly with the device in front of them or using it remote volunteers on the internet. He would set this up on the internet and run the experiments on the internet. And it would show that their concentration or not concentration, intention or not intention, could change the probability distributions on the measurement device for this double slit experiment. So that means in a totally isolated device here that's you can directly, in fact, impact quantum states. We have to have a model that shows that how the mind interacts with quantum states directly as a result of this model. There's no other choice here for that. Okay. Likewise, Stiller did a similar kind of experiment. He did what's called a gas discharge device. He would take a gas discharge device, which was essentially a sandwich that had gas in it, and it would be thresholded, near threshold and it was shielded. All of these were shielded. And then he would shield the volunteer, and he could directly influence the avalanche rate. Essentially, he would change the tunneling rate across the gap such that more of the current would flow through the avalanche. Okay, and when he was doing this, people who could see auras could describe the fact that there was a connection, as if these aqua cords were connecting between the observer, even though this was all in an electrically shielded room. Okay, Faraday cages. So both of these are significant in the sense that no electromagnetic effects could be possible to account for this phenomenon. Okay, so these are both research that's been done for more than 10 years. And I think Dean's work is about that old, and Tiller's might even be older than that. But these are significant, and we have to have an account for this, okay? So look, out of time noise. So time is what prevents everything from happening at once, according to John Wheeler. He's quoted as saying that. So we have quantum physics consistency versus causality, okay? So time, we think about time as due to causality, but physics is all about consistency. That's what the Bell entanglement and self-consistency is about. We know this is true because there's a thing called the delayed choice quantum eraser experiments, where after the fact, you can tell which path it went on by what you measured, okay? And so it's essentially the future affecting the past, okay? And we know this is true in psychology too, because presentience can be either conscious or conscious, where the physiology appears to respond to future emotional images. Essentially, they have an emotional images, 10,000 pictures, and they do an experiment where they take a baseline, they randomly pick a picture out of the 10,000, they show it to you, and your physiology responds. What they found in these presentience experiments is that your physiology started responding before the image was even picked. In other words, if it's strong emotional images, your body is looking into the future and seeing it. And they found this in a database of conventional psychological research who weren't even looking for this. So this was all the baseline analysis, meta-analysis of baseline for this research, this kind of research. So this stuff is real. It might be unconscious, but it's still real. It shows up in experimental measure. So you can also have precognition. This particular, I'm going to show you an example, a remote viewing example here in a minute, but you can basically predict what's going to be in a newspaper 2 days from now, when the newspaper contents aren't even picked until the day before. So this is, I know the lady who did this. I met her at the Monroe Institute. Her name's Patricia Cyrus, and she's released a paper about this. But you can also do precognitive dreams. The structure of DNA came from a dream. So also there's this notion of retrocausation. Future knowledge can affect your decisions and you do now. And here's an experiment that you can do. You study something, take a test, and you can tell if you study a second time, either before the test or after the test, both cases you improve your score on the test. So the second time that you study it, if it can be after the test, when you know what the questions are, you can do this. And we ask children about this and they go, oh yeah, they know this is true because they do it all the time. Kids naturally do this and they cheat by knowing the answers. It's like getting the scores ahead of time, knowing what the answers are ahead of time, studying the answers for those, and then but you're doing it after the fact, but it affects your knowing when you're taking the exam because you're tapping into your future knowing because it's outside of time. So this retrocausation is tapping into future knowing, and it's very important to do this, okay? So there's this notion of what I call panoramic time, where if you have a life review, near-death experience, you have a life review, but essentially what you're doing is you're stepping out of time and you're looking above time as though time was space below you. But there's also this notion of NLP, timeline therapy, and the Monroe Institute. I was in a state in the Monroe Institute where I didn't know what sequential times happened anymore. I was in an advanced state of awareness, but I didn't remember what order things happened anymore. So you lose your sense of temporal order when you're in these advanced states. And that's what happens when you're so these are all related to this notion of that you're somehow out of time. So here's an example of a precognitive remote viewing experience I did with Patricia. She had a dream one night. She says, Doug, this dream, they used the term invariant phase shifting. Well, remember I was using phase invariant ensembles before? And if you were thinking about the old way of modems work, they use phase shift keying or frequency shift keying. So she was using a term that was a conglomerate of the things I was working back on 2005. She called invariant phase keying, variant phase shifting. So it's like, how would you use invariant phase to do communications? That's what this looked at. So I said to her, without telling her, a couple of weeks later after she told me this phrase, I says, I wrote this piece of paper down, put it next to my bed on an envelope and put the label on it for what the experiment was. And I said, remote view this target. And she came up with this. She says, I'm seeing that what looks like this thoughts and slide. She says thoughts of a slide, a bacterial culture, but with this stuff coming in and out of it. She drew this. And so here's a bigger picture of that. Well, what's amazing is this is the exact same picture I had in my mind when I was in 1980s and I was visiting Dean Radin at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Site. I was just trying to describe what I wanted to do. I wanted to build a device that the mind could influence, and it would look like this. And she drew this picture that looked exactly like it using this technology, using this idea here, okay? In addition to that, she drew this picture of the building where this work was going to be done. This was in 2005. Well, several years later, I started working with a semiconductor company to build such a device like this. And this is the picture of the building. And if you were to look at the modalities of this building, the lines and the colors and the shapes and the stuff, this building, she captured the essence of this building. And this building is not a typical building of a kind of buildings that are around Dallas, because this one has this window box approach to its system like this with the parking right out front. So this was 3.5 years later. I was just aghast when I realized what she'd done, not only the retro causation part of it, but the building the 3.5 years later. And so I actually succeeded in building a prototype of this chip. And so I'm ready to go in and turn that into a product at some point. But then my interaction with this company didn't continue, so I stopped working with them. But we did get a prototype slide out by that. So when I say that the mental states affect the temporal window, you can think of consciousness as like this. Most people get higher frequency. That's what the computing does, okay? And so, which means the frequency, the wavelength gets shorter and shorter and shorter, and the energy gets higher and higher and higher. But these windows is isolating itself from the rest. So if you can lower the wavelength of thought, which is what you do when you meditate, the wavelength expands, you no longer fit in the wavelength of the brain. And so now you're disassociated from the brain, and everything in this window is considered simultaneous. So this is my model for how you get lower frequency gives you smarter, because you're tapping in, you're stepping out of time, and your slower thoughts get you disconnected from your brain. And so you're not in time anymore. And that's what happened when I was at the Monroe Institute. I didn't know what order things were happening anymore. So you can arbitrarily take any computation in the mind and turn it into totally concurrent computation, and you can't figure out what order things happened anymore. So this is my model for how to do that. So everybody has these real intelligent quantum mind capabilities, okay? And this is all the stuff we've just talked. So you can go and review this at your note, because I know I'm running late. So let's do this remote viewing target here, okay? So last minute here, write down your impressions and submodalities. Draw versus name. Don't try to name it. So lines, colors, shapes. I'm looking at it right now. It's been sitting next to me the whole time. Shapes, orientation, motion, emotion, maybe even a purpose, okay? So is everybody, let's say everybody's ready now, and they had these little thoughts, these little rotes that show up in their brain when they thought about this remote viewing target. And so they're ready. So I'm going to show it to you now. This is what it is. So the modalities of this, and some modalities, is that it's a cylinder, it's yellow, it has an emotional happy, it's a pen, its purpose, its orientation is horizontal, okay? And it has a special trigger in it, whereas if you push it like this, it spins. So it's a game, it's a fun game, it's a pen, and here it is. And so at the end, I want people to share what submodalities they got for this target. This is what convinced me 50 years ago that if I can do this, I can do this stuff. This is the inherent part of who we are as humans, and it's the real intelligence, and it's the mind, not in the brain, that's part of this, okay? So how many symbolic modalities did you get matched, okay? So there's just a few, there's one slide here, the predictions, and then the questions, okay? So training for supermind, awareness in society, we're gonna have, people are gonna meditate, they're gonna use the intention host devices, they're gonna practice law of attraction, NLP, body experiences, encourage transpersonal experiences, touching the divine. We're going to notice presentience and use retrocausation. You can actually use retrocausation to your own benefit. Let's say you're trying to make a decision. Every time you get to make a decision and you chose the right decision in the future, you know you have a right decision. If you celebrate that, when you're making the decision, you can feel that emotion in the future, and you can say, I'm going to pick the one that feels better. And if you do that by programming retrocausation in the future so that you can make the decision in the past. So this is something that you can actually do. You can actually do this stuff. You can just choose to do it. So, so you can learn telepathy. I want to work with Susie Miller and teach people how to do telepathy and how to write it, and her light language. I call it a light language. Develop training in movies for people to stop thinking about this stuff as paranormal and this is normal, okay? So what we're going to do, confirm these experiments, and we're going to build technology. And I want to create a well-funded development and research organization, because basically people aren't developing in this and spending money in this like they are doing AI and quantum computing and space travel. They're spending tens of billions of dollars in all of those things. This stuff is significantly more important than any of that other stuff. And in fact, it surpasses all that other stuff. We wouldn't need space travel if we could remote view over to the moon. And I know people who can do that, remote view to the moon or astro travel to the moon. So this is well known that we don't need to physically travel in space, but this is who we are as humans, okay? So again, here's all the endorsements for my book that's coming up. Dean Radin, Aaron Laszlo, Mark Gruber is another guy who wrote a book similar to this. And Nisha is also wrote a book about Tiller. And Deborah Singleton, here's Susie Miller and Deborah. Those are my two friends who are psychic friends. And that's the question and answer period. So I'm going to stop sharing now. So questions?
Doug, thank you. Rachel. Rachel, you have to unmute.
Sorry. So first I just want to thank you for being like open with some of these like weirder, more out there beliefs, because I feel like my talk might get a little bit weird too. And then secondly, I had a question
This is
about
normal, by the way. This is normal, not paranormal. That's the message.
yeah, I've kind of had a paradigm shift with that this year because I've been studying at this place called Academy of Intuition Medicine, which has really helped me with sort of managing sensitivity. But the question is, so you had like the 90 degrees that were overlapping on one another. And then before that you showed like the orthogonal plane. Is that like some sort of self-similarity thing where it's like replicating that plane?
Well, remember, if you have two orthogonal things, you can show it in a plane. If you have three orthogonal things, you can show it in a volume. But if you have four orthogonal things, you can't really show it in 3 dimensions. So it's like a projection of thing that's something that's bigger. You can only show it mathematically. Something that's bigger that can't map into 3 dimensions except as a shadow. So that's the 4-dimensional unit hypercube. You know, anytime you're trying to show something in a fewer number of dimensions, you're going to get some property, some metric that's anisotropic. In other words, it looks longer or shorter, and it should be all the same, right? That's this notion of physics and relativity. Relativity says I should have the same properties no matter which. If I could get 10 miles per gallon going north and south, but I would get 20 going east and west, that would be an anisotropic behavior. And physics doesn't work that way. It's relativistic. It's the same in no matter which direction and orientation I have. But if you start putting things in hyperdimensional space, you can hardly talk about it easily because you can't draw it in a height. So I'm trying to come up with different metaphors for talking about if you have a set of bits and they're all hyperdimensional space and they form these bigger thought vectors, which are like a pickup sticks, again, in a hyperdimensional space. They're all orthogonal, and it's hard to even visualize that. But one of my abilities is the ability to think about that and not get lost in doing it. So did that answer your question?
Somewhat, and then I'm probably gonna go and rewatch that part again too.
Nicola. Nope.
Doug, thank you.
Nicola?
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah.
I'll
Can you hear?
Sorry. Yeah.
Hello. Can
Go
you hear
ahead.
me?
I hear you. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, you can hear me, Doug. So
I'll hear-
yeah. I just got warmth. I got emotion. I started to get like a teddy bear. I thought, no. And you know, I just saw the modalities. Yeah, there was emotion. There was warmth, warm emotion.
Yeah, the happy thought from the smiley faces on here. I don't know if you can see the little smiley faces. Yeah.
I can imagine actually, because I probably blanked that out because I really hate emojis. So yeah, I mean, and that's a really interesting thing, like with telepathy, is one has to let go of all these. Yeah. Like there is just so much that I relate to, which I'm not surprised about because obviously I really relate to Mike's work. And I'm really interested that you're into tetrahedra, and I'm really interested in that again, the Pythagorean thing comes up, and this relates to this thing of like space, not time. I've had this sentence in my head since I don't know when, which is space is more mysterious than time. And you know, because everybody, you know, obviously I grew up with this whole thing, you know, like space, 2001 Space Time Odyssey, blah, blah, and so time and relativity, blah, blah. I don't know, space is more mysterious than time. And that's what, you know, this is what you're going into with the hyperdimensionality and the orthogonality as well, because this is what kind of, for me, it's to do with, again, it's really interesting because like obviously prime numbers have also really been important for me. This is a really very personal, so this should be like I need to connect with you separately. Yeah. But there's this thing of like, you know, so qualities of numbers. So I like, as far as I'm concerned, like numbers are beings, right? You know, they're kind of like semi-divine processes. But there's always this thing of like, I'm thinking, well, okay, like the small numbers, like really important, but then kind of like others, as well, they've all got qualities. And like if you're thinking about hyperdimensions and all this orthogonality, then you've got more equality. And I really like that. So I'm just, will you, Mark, do you send out the PowerPoint separately as well? Or can you send that?
I'll put those on my website. I'll put those on my website. So.
Yeah, because I want to send this to a lot of people. Like my youngest son did maths. He did a master's in maths, and now he's into computers and stuff. And I'm still friends. I'm obviously friends with him, but also with quite a lot of those guys and women. And I want to send this to them, and I'll send the AMP. I've been meaning to send the AMP, the list of the program anyway, because I just think there are a lot of these people. There are older people out in, especially obviously people, like I've got a Sacred Maths Research Group, Vanessa and Pat are both involved in that. And so, but there's more people I would like to get involved. So thank you.
Yeah. So there's a guy from England who wrote Born on a Blue Day, and he's the guy who owns the 20,000 digits of pi. And he basically, he has all of his submodalities for numbers and lights and emotions are all tied together, so he can remember 20,000 digits of pi, because it's like a journey through this valley of color. He does synesthesia of colors and numbers and stuff like that. So if you're interested in that stuff, go read Born on a Blue Day. And he's one of the...
Born on a Blue Day.
He's an autistic guy, by the way. Like
yeah. I made a note of awesomeism, because I've got a friend who works with young people who are autistic, and she'll really love that as well.
You look like the letters that she wrote. The letters look like the form from Laws of Form,
Yeah. Connection.
My wife is learning German because my daughter moved to Switzerland, but I want to learn that language. I want to learn light languages, my next language.
Right. Yeah. That sounds good. Great.
So the book should be out it's in layout right now, and it's actually done with layout. And so I'm hoping the book will be out in another month or so. And this is a 5-year journey of love, by the way. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah. That's we've been talking about that. Like there's really, like in Anpa, it is this, like so many different things have been coming. I've been talking with Mike about this, and it is because everybody is actually motivated by love, and that's then things happen. Good things happen. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I better
Anybody have any feedback about their little things?
Well, Andrew.
Yes. Firstly, I did draw a sphere on a stick. If you're interested.
Put it a little bit closer so we can see it, Andrew. A little bit closer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Those have some of the features.
It's okay. Are you aware that some of the ideas you're putting forward about precognition and astral travel are in this well-known novel by Philip K. Dick?
There's lots of books out there. My hero is Robert Monroe, and he founded the Monroe Institute, and he was an engineer, and he was a jokester though. He said he had when we went to his classes there near the kitchen, he had the sign that says E = MC squared plus or minus 3 dB. Because he was an audio engineer. So he said it couldn't be exact. It had to be plus or minus 3 dB. So that was his sense of humor. So.
Anyway, Philip K. Dick as the answer to everything.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'm for many years, I have very much enjoyed, I pulled this off the shelf while you were talking, Sparse Distributed Memory by, what is it?
Pentti Kanerva.
I've always loved that book. I never knew whether it was bonkers or not. Is it serious?
Essentially, Pentti Kanerva worked with a guy, and it's talked about in my book too, guy who founded Palm Pilot, whose name is, I'm blocking on his name, I'll come in a minute. And now he's founded a company called Numenta. And Numenta basically says, look, if you're doing AI and you're not using sparse distributed coding, you're not doing AI. Essentially, it gives you mathematical properties that you can't get unless you're using sparse distributed coding. And the math that I worked on.
It is taken seriously.
Oh yeah, it's very, in fact, Penticanerva work, if you go numenta.com, you can see Hawkins is his name, Jeff Hawkins. And this is a different one person than David Hawkins, who's the guy who did Power versus Force. But Jeff Hawkins founded a company, and he's taken his millions from tens of millions, hundreds of millions from Palm Pilot that he sold, and he's doing neurocomputing, and he's building systems that are trainable. You can buy a product on Amazon Web Services called Grok, and you can use it for security detection because it detects faster than anybody else a new pattern, faster than anybody else. So these are scientists and engineers who are taking this technology and actually building products with it, kind of like Chris Doran is with the ray tracing stuff.
Thank you.
John Hyatt.
Yeah, thanks for that, Doug. I don't know whether you saw it. I drew a yellow thing with a knob on the end and black marks where you have the black band.
Yeah, and you interpreted it as a banana, which was interesting. You injected some stuff that you thought that must be a banana because you saw all the other stuff. That's perfect. I was hoping you would say something, John.
I was just thinking, you know, when we look at distant galaxies, we're looking at the past. So the further you look out, the further you're looking into the past. Well, the question has to be asked: where's the future then? And then probably in the way that in Flatland, the next dimension always emerges from the middle of the one before. Probably we'll find the next dimension is by going inwards, I would think.
Yeah. Well, I treat time as panoramic time. And the reason is because in NLP technology, they use the timeline therapy of the Hawaiians. And essentially you go above time and you're looking down at your life as if it's a bunch of puppets. And you can see all your previous lives and your ancestral lives as well. And you can essentially say, I'm going to merge my current self with my older self. And because my current self is smarter, I'm going to do the superposition of those and influence the past. So that's called timeline therapy. It's built on the Hawaiians' techniques. And so they've used those techniques as part of NLP training. And I have an NLP master practitioner. And timeline therapy is very valuable. The people who are working on NLP are very smart because they're doing all this stuff that are affecting people's lives. To give you an example, one lady was at a meeting one day, a meditation meeting that I was at, and she came really late. She says, I'm glad you came here. She says, well, I had to drive here because I can't drive over any bridges. I'm afraid of driving over bridges. So I proceeded to do what's called a phobia cure with her for 5 minutes. And next week she showed up on time and she says, your phobia cure, which is NLP technique, cured me instantly. I can now drive over bridges, you know? And so it's like, how is it possible that you can do these phenomenal things? And Richard Bandler was one guy who invented this technique, and it's using this notion of modalities and submodalities, which is part of these structure of visual, auditory, and kinesthetic, these abstract forms that are related to patterns and features that our mind is actually built on these features. And so submodalities and modalities is an important way of looking at this, and that's what rotes are. And that's what we were just practicing with this remote viewing experiment. We were asking for your mind to look at features without putting a label on it. And so how can you do that without superimposing your preconceived notion of what the answer is on that?
Well, I'm very pleased to find that other people are doing these experiments because I've just been doing them by myself.
You go to NLP classes. I'm sure there's great classes in England if you're in England, but there's great places all over the U.S. I studied for 5 years, essentially a master's degree in NLP, as far as money and time goes, and met a lot of amazing people with amazing abilities.
Yeah. Richard?
Yes. Your description of standing over your own personal timeline and looking through it sounds exactly like taking a YouTube, putting the cursor on it, and moving it back and forth over the little red line at the bottom to see past and future of what you're watching.
Yeah.
Next question is, can you change what's going on by doing that?
From timeline therapy says you can actually change your emotional past by influencing your emotional future. And Robert Monroe had a helper that he called Inspec. So if you read Robert Monroe's books, again, he's my hero, and he had this virtual helper that helped him at various times in his travels as an out-of-body experience person, and he called it Inspec, but it was his own future self influencing himself in the past.
That's interesting.
So
Timeline.
plenty of examples of that. So it's just a matter of you have to look and know where to look to find them. So
Right. Robert Heinlein, in several of his novels, and I cannot remember which ones at the moment, occasionally used that technique.
Body, Far Journeys, and Ultimate Journey. Yeah. If you ever have a chance to go to the Monroe Institute, when of course COVID allows us to open up again, it's worth going. He developed the HemiSync technology, which is now being used by the HemiSync technology is even being used. Alexander, he's using HemiSync technology.
Okay, I think Peter, Marcia, and Lou, did you have a question as well?
Yes. I just wanted to show my.
Okay.
You can see that, yeah. I thought you might find that amusing.
A sphere and a circle. Yeah,
yes,
it looks like the top. Definitely the top.
Right.
Thank you.
Right.
Peter?
Okay. Peter Marcia?
I'm quite I'm quite in agreement that this kind of thing could be the basis of the future evolution of the human mind. But what does really puzzle me is that in the past, why did not the people who didn't have any scientific background whatsoever in modern science, why didn't they make use of these properties, or do you think they did, to do things in more primitive societies?
They did use it. Just that we're interpreting how they used it in the sense of our modern technology world. But shamans through antiquity used the technology to keep their tribe safe, and they would do out of time, out of body experiment. They would go out of body and they would go out of time, and they would keep their countries, their tribe safe and their people safe. And so the shamans are the people who did this, but also the Tibetan monks and the people who did use work on prana. Essentially, in the book we talk about that Eastern philosophy is interested in like Tibetan and those philosophies in Hindu, that they're interested in what's called true permanence. And they're thinking that thought is the only truly permanent thing in the universe, and that matter and energy and time and space are not. So they went to the extreme polarization of anything physical is unreal and anything of the mind is real. And in in Western society, we take the opposite side of the coin and say everything that we can't measure isn't real, and anything that we can't measure is not real. And so it turns out they're not incompatible. It's just that you got to assume that what are the assumptions going in, and there's a whole section in my book about that topic. And so essentially the Theosophical Society was studying ancient Indian techniques, and they were using a meditation technique that allowed them to see quarks 50 years before quarks were invented in atoms. So believe me, when it's advanced technology, it's just put it in context with our current technology, how they meld together is really the interesting part of it. So hopefully that answered your question, Peter.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've read this book that was really, really fascinating about the Mexican shaman in, is it Castellanos?
Yeah. Go read any of Dean Radin's books, all of them, Real Magic, supernatural.
Yeah. No, but,
all of his books are great. They're talking about a lot of the history of that stuff.
no, but they were a very fascinating set of books by is it Castellanos?
Castaneda.
Castaneda.
Yeah. So about yes, and you know, he was able to. He claimed the shaman in his book was able to you know, move about the universe by
observer frame, manipulating his observer frame.
and I did at one time have a consultancy Aikido Enterprise. More or less, it was based on the principle that if you place yourself at the center of the universe, then your opponent is defeated before he even decides to attack you.
Yeah. I talk about that.
Because nobody can defeat the universe.
Yeah, I talk about that in the book too, and it's like even the NLP inventor, he calls it hyperthesia. He says you can beat any opponent, even a fifth black belt person, if you can warp time and space and basically make him stand still compared to you. And so, you know, so
It's all
Richard Bandler teaches this. Richard Bandler basically said he was teaching a person who had a batting slump. He was a baseball player and he had a batting slump, and he basically said, "How should I pay you? You know, how much you want to charge me?" He says, "I won't charge you anything up front. I will charge you 1% of your increase in salary as a result of what I do for you." And so the guy says, "Sure, that seems like a good deal," you know, because there was no. So he taught the batter to warp time and warp space, and therefore he could see a fastball, slow it down, and hit it. And when he did that, and by the way, Bandler did this and he never batted in his life and was freaking out the pitcher because the pitcher was a world-class pitcher and Bandler was hitting everything he threw at him. So when you look at this, and so Bandler's money that he got was $5 million because his increase in the salary that he got was $50 million.
Well, I mean, I'm really interested in this because I wrote a paper with and became a colleague of Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo astronaut, who founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences as a result of his, as a result really of his experiences while coming back from the moon to the Earth.
Yeah, Dean Radin.
Is a really
Dean Radin works for the Institute.
Incredibly fascinating guy.
Yeah, all these people are all these great biographies for all these people. So, but I may have the numbers wrong as far as the dollar amounts go, but it's that kind of numbers. It's just you know, they'll quote me saying you said the wrong numbers. I'll say I'll qualify this. I don't know what the exact numbers are, but it's.
Yes, a physics question, please. I might have asked this before or not.
Vanessa.
Okay, Vanessa. I'm waiting, Vanessa. Unmute. There you go. Thanks.
I didn't have a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. My powers of perception are failing me, I'm afraid. Nicola, you got a question?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, I mean, just going back to remembering, I mean, I had loads of questions going through, so it's just a question of remembering, because there was somewhere where you talked about verb-noun operators, and I was very interested in that because this, the relationship between verb and noun, you know, the thing is that, it actually relates to what you were talking about, the difference between the Eastern approach and the Western approach. So you know, we've just been making things and nouns, just anything comes out, this, you know, let's clunk it, you know. I mean, I don't really like making things concrete because, oh my goodness, here we go. Whereas the verb is the actual doing, is the flow, you know. So it's very interesting that you put them together, because anything that puts two seeming opposites together looks like a good way ahead. So I'm just wondering if you want to say anything more about that. Oh, what's that, Pete Marcy, you've got? That's nice.
That is an object that has actually been on the moon.
Oh, great.
Oh,
thank you. Yeah. So,
It's not mine. It belongs to my my grandson, who
Nice.
came when who visited Edgar at home
Right.
once, and he was given it by
Right.
Edgar.
Nice.
Oh,
Thank you. Thanks for
So
sharing that, Peter.
it's really
Yeah,
very
absolutely.
fascinating to think where it's been, particularly when one sees the moon in the sky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, Nicola, um,
Yeah.
verb, I try to come up with a common sense name, and you guys talk about it as operator versus state. You know, the fact that you can use it as both an operator or a state, data versus a program in computer science. But so I tried to create a thing that was sort of dominate. I put the verb first instead of noun verb. I put verb noun. It just as a common way of talking about the fact that everything is both can be used as a state or an operator. It has both characteristics. And so this, you know, this T-shirt that is, you know, that the British have where, you know, I'm just being calm, you know, well, being calm is not only a state, but has an effect on other people around you. So it's a verb noun sentence, if you want to look at that, you know. And so, and in fact, one of my healer friends, she would teach her daughter about this stuff. They would go into a store, a department store, and they'd go to a part of the store that had nobody in it. And they would just sit there and turn on their energy and start building their energy. And pretty soon, tens of people unconsciously would come over to that part of the store when they weren't there before. And so this notion of attraction to energy, and even at an unconscious level, is the state, but your act of being is also an act of action, okay? And you can affect the universe by that way. So I'm hoping that we all meditate for the US election in November so that we can affect, by our calmness, the effect of the election.
Oh, it's the effect of the lockdown, I think, is the thing that we need to meditate on. Clearing fear. It's basically, there's a lot of fear around.
I go into this a lot in the book. There's tons of examples of this. And so the TM.
I wonder if I could ask a question, because obviously you presented a very interesting explanation for these very profound and puzzling phenomena. And I wonder if to explain explanation, because explanation itself needs unpicking.
Yes.
What is it? Why are we driven to produce explanations?
Yeah.
And what are they?
Yeah. An explanation sounds like a linguistic thing. I use the term representation, which sounds more like a computer science thing. And so is there a, quote, not mechanism as in physical mechanism, but is there a representational mechanism that would allow these behaviors to occur that you could show that has these properties that seem complementary or normally paradoxical? And the answer is yes, because quantum, the infrastructure that supports quantum is so fundamentally different. Not only is the quantum result so fundamentally different, but that structure itself is so fundamentally different than we're used to, that it has the power to do all of quantum physics and all of the quantum mind stuff too on top of it. So, I mean, if you look at all the complexity, Bose-Einstein condensate, black holes, quark neutron stars, I mean, supernovas, you look at all of that stuff and you go, that's due to quantum mechanics.
I'm just mindful of Gregory Bateson. So, in the first metalogue at the beginning of Steps, and of course, this was so influential on Richard Bandler. And they have this discussion, Daddy, what's an instinct? And Bateson replies, it's an explanatory principle.
Yes.
What do you mean? You know this passage. So how do we reconcile this? Is this an explanatory principle, or is this something else?
If you were a Hindu monk and you had studied in the mountains meditated in the mountains for 20 years and you got this nirvana state, then you would be wondering of all that stuff and you wouldn't have to use language to explain it. So you would just know the answer. So how is it that you can know something, know that it was yellow but not a banana? How could you know the properties of this thing without language.
Yeah.
And so you have to have not an explanation, but a mechanism or representation or some other word, a verb nounness thing that allows this to occur. And that's all I'm trying to do is allow us to say, tap into your meditation in your direct knowing, your direct awareness, your direct nirvana. Nirvana is, I mean, what's the difference between a nirvana state where you have all knowing, which means you have all dimensions in the universe that you're attached to, and the void, which is the zero null of the middle of all of that? What's the difference between those two? It's just an observer frame perspective. One is including the volume, the entire volume of everything in the universe. The other one is a 0 point. So you're manipulating your space-time properties of the inclusive dimensions that you have. And so those.
So this is being.
Experience. That's experience.
Yeah.
That's what we have to touch.
So this is ontology in the sense that ontology is being rather than knowing. That's what you're talking about.
But it's a non-computational being. Roger
Yes.
Penrose.
Yes.
Yeah, non-computational. It's like, I know I had, when I was at the Monroe Institute, I was talking with four-leaf clovers and they were talking back. And I got in this state and I can't remember what order things happened that morning. I mean, I can piece it back together afterwards, and that's when my spirit guide started giving me a lecture about tetrahedron space, you know, and it's like, oh, this is what people talk about who are mystics. And this is what I call touching the divine. If you've never touched the divine, then you don't really know who you are yet. And I would encourage everybody to figure out how to touch the divine in some way so that you realize, oh, that's who we really are. And the language we use, we're spiritual beings having a physical experience. And that's not my words, that's other people's words. But I happen to agree with it because as long as you're touching the divine at that level, then you're not thinking about it. You're not even knowing about it. You're just being it. You know, so hopefully that gave you an explanation without being an explanation.
Well, yeah, it's recursive and circular.
Which is all of this is all that way.
Indeed, that's right.
Thanks for the question, though, Mark.
Yeah. Any other questions? Nicola.
Again, here I am again. Just one thing, Mike Wright would really like this, you know, because I mean, I've been wanting to get him to talk at some point, but because his thing is totally about the problem with physics being set up in this verb, you know, sort of like noun-verb separation. You know, there's this whole thing like Hopi language is much closer to quantum physics.
Yeah, it's verb dominant instead of noun dominant.
Yeah, exactly. So that's just one thing that we must get Mike Wright to watch this, and anyway, maybe he'll give a talk. So, but the other thing is, do you have any experience of nature spirits and or angels?
My belief is that angels and aliens are the same thing. They're hyperdimensional advanced beings, and just how we label them. So one of the parts of my book is the law of attraction. This whole correlative system says, look, there is no physics energy-based mechanism how we could have law of attraction. Law of attraction says two things with similar meaning are attracted to each other. Well, we don't have any representation for meaning in physics, and we certainly don't have anything that's attractive under that situation. But correlative mathematics is attractive based on meaning, because the content is the address. Okay. Yeah. So I have a whole section in the book about law of attraction and correlatives, and as soon as you do that, you end up with that the mind is the only place where this meaning occurs, because the only place where we actually have a hyperdimensional space where meaning can aggregate. Okay, and that's the vortex part of it. Okay, and so meaning and law of attraction and are directly related to this verb noun model, and that's equivalent to the Carlos Castaneda's assemblage point. It's like where we put our consciousness in this hyperdimensional space is what we believe our reality is. Okay, and you know, and in Carlos Castaneda, basically you had to have enough control over your assemblage points that you could throw yourself off a cliff and teleport before you hit the bottom. That's called the impeccable warrior test. Okay. And so I don't know if I answered your question, but I think I forgot the question.
Yeah. No, you went into the angels. You haven't been into the nation states.
Angels and aliens are just these advanced technology. Oh, sorry, I was talking about law of attraction. Esther Hicks' law of attraction is, Abraham is considered an infinite intelligent being that talks through Esther during her channeling sessions. Well, what is an infinite intelligent being, which a multi-being? It's like 10 or 12 beings that are interacting with her while she's communicating telepathically. Well, how can you have a model for infinite intelligent non-corporeal beings if you don't have a model for thought that allows a superposition? So it's a superposition of all of those personalities talking together in a CDMA style intelligence system. So at least it's a mathematical model for how you could do that, you know. That's
okay.
It's like you mix red and blue and you get purple. It's like that. It's like at the molecule level, that's the best we can think about it. Or music, you combine these instruments, you get an orchestra. The same thing is due with thought. You can mix thoughts and they work together, but they don't cancel each other out. So.
We should stop in a second. Mike Horner, did you have a question?
Yes, I do.
It'll be the last one, I think.
Doug, on your phrase, touching the divine, we heard Peter Marcer say that he'd had what is sometimes called the oceanic experience. And then I believe that Andrew blew the gaff and gone through his near-death experience with cancer. In a sense, touched the divine. What is, in a sort of statistical sense, do you think nearly everybody has had the opportunity and they just don't talk about it? Or is it a very small, privileged subset of society?
Well, I believe everybody dreams every night. That's one of the slides at the end that I kind of went through fast. Everybody does this all the time. This is real intelligence. Everybody dreams every night. In fact, if you didn't, you would go crazy after a while. So it's required the mind disconnect from the brain. Well, why is that? And people say, oh, it's just garbage collection. It's not anything. No, it's the mind and the brain stop paying attention to each other so it can do, so it can be its real self. It's in a non-entropy environment, right? So this notion of touching the divine, we do it every night when we sleep. We just don't remember it. And you can study to be a lucid dreamer so that you can actually become aware and remember and be lucid during your dreams. But most people don't find it important enough to do it.
Okay,
yeah,
thanks.
Everybody can do this. Everybody can remote view. Everybody dreams. Okay. Everybody can do retrocausation. Everybody can do telepathy. If you ever saw, you're driving down the road and all of a sudden this thought goes, there's a cop up, and then you slow down and then you see that there's a cop up there. You just sent yourself pre-sentient message from your future self to your slightly older self, a message that says there's a cop up there, and you got it. So everybody can do this. And so everybody can do this. And the only thing that's keeping us from doing it more reliably is our belief that it's impossible or that we can't do it. So we are more powerful than we believe or allow ourselves to be.
I have one more Dilbert-like comment for you.
Yeah, I like Dilbert.
Did you attend the one and only Time Travelers meeting alone, or were you with Robert Monroe?
I've actually met Robert Monroe, you know, and since he travels everywhere in the multiverse, he has so many people, and in fact, he has so many copies of himself in a multi-processor way, interacting with everybody simultaneously in the multiverse. So I probably have worked with him at the multiverse level, and I know people who, I have lots of stories from the Monroe Institute because I hang out with a lot of people from the Monroe Institute, some of them who've gone a dozen times and are quite mystics. But I have a lot of respect for what he did and what he's done.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah. Okay. All right, well, folks, we're running slightly over, but Doug, my I don't know about anybody else, but my brain is completely blown, and in a good way. And I'm very grateful for you opening all our minds in this way. So thank you. So
How to put 40,
tomorrow,
how to put 400 pages into an hour, right?
Yeah.
How to put
Well, there you
400
go.
pages of my book into an hour. Yeah.
So tomorrow, Lou, is you're doing something on? Do you want to say something quickly about that?
I thought you had me on I thought you had me on September 11, or is it Lynn Claire and
Oh no,
me?
this is the discovery of 2 new geometric forms.
Oh yes, this is really Lynn Claire's talk, and
Okay.
and it has to do with finding new ways to think about the Marian geometry by spinning beautiful patterns, and it is fueled by Chad, who will be speaking to us about his work with the computer.
All right. Well, we'll look forward to that tomorrow. And thank you ever so much for a very open-minded session today, Doug, and everybody else has been so open-minded as well. So it's been very good. So we'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks,
And
everybody.
Lynn Claire has had 3 near-death experiences.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Just for you to know, Doug.
That's good to know.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Take care and yes, just avoid those near-death experiences as best you can.
Emphasize the near part and not the death part, right?
Unless you want to be reborn.